Military coups in Mali. Why have there been so many coups? What has triggered this resurgence of coups? Why has the Malian military launched these military takeovers? What was the response of the Malian people to these military takeovers? What has been the U.S. response to the coups in Mali from 1968 to 2021? Mali is officially the Republic of Mali, is a landlocked country in West Africa. It's the 8th largest country in Africa, roughly about 480,000 square miles, with a population of approximately 19.1 million people. Interestingly, 67% of its population is estimated to be under the age of 25. That was back in 2017. The capital of the country, which happens to be the largest city, is Bamako. The sovereign state of Mali consists of 8 regions, and its borders on the north reach deep into the Sahara Desert. The country's southern part is in the Sudanese savannah, where the majority of its inhabitants live. Both the Niger and Senegal rivers pass through it. The economy is largely agriculture, with mining. The most prominent resource in Mali is gold. The country is the 3rd largest producer of gold on the African continent, and it also exports salt. Since its inception at becoming the Republic of Mali, there have been 5 military coups. The first coup took place on 19 November 1968. President Modibo Keïta's regime was overthrown. On March 22, 2012, President Amadou Touré, whose regime was overthrown by a military coup. On 24 May 2021, President Ba and Da's regime was overthrown. And on 26 March 1991, President Moussa Touré's regime was overthrown. And the latest coup was on 18 August 2020. President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta's regime was overthrown. In all these 5 coups, there are some similarities in terms of the impact of the coup, not only on the Republic of Mali, but on the region. Each coup triggered regional instability. Each coup was preceded by months of both violent and nonviolent protests for those who were pushing for democracy and constitutional rule. And the main political opposition found themselves being kidnapped because the military was unwilling to relinquish power. Security forces were dispersed to break up protesters, to deter the movements. This also put democracy in a very vulnerable position, and change by nonviolent democratic means was called into question. Many of the Malian citizens successfully used nonviolent action in all 5 of these situations to push for an end of one-party rule, to push to have the people's voices heard, to reopen the economy that was contracting due to a wave of International Monetary Fund austerity programs that hit the middle and lower classes especially hard. And in one case, a small group of female merchants protested specific pieces of legislation that impacted their abilities to take care of their families. As well, regional and international efforts to stabilize Mali focused mostly on security, neglecting decades of failed governance, neglecting, unlike what we see today, to push for democracy in Ukraine, and most certainly for Malian people, the demand for change remains far from fulfilled. Many are concerned about the waves of government corruption, international interference in inaction, ongoing instability, the lack of healthcare. Think today with the pandemic from COVID, and the disastrous impact these 5 coups have had on education. In each case, the failures of governance has led to huge losses of life, mostly civilians in Mali. And the ouster of each one of these corrupt leaders, or even those leaders who were democratically elected, have been profound in terms of political, economic, and security challenges. But despite widespread regional and international condemnation of the coup, many Malians have been celebratory because they thought it was the end of one bad rule, as we saw on our own January 6th, the attempt of a head of state to hold on to power in the United States. For the most part, the coups in Mali were quick and peaceful, but a coup is a coup, whether it's quick and peaceful or violent. 19 November 1968, coup d'etat. President Mobito Kito's regime overthrown by Colonel Amadou Touré. President Mobito Kito was the first president of Mali from 1960 to 1968. He also served as the prime minister of a regional organization, the Mali Federation. He espoused a form of African socialism, which in its purest form embraces ideals of both democracy and socialism as a way of establishing a society and government. He was born into the colonial French Sudan. His family were Muslims who claimed direct descent from the Kita dynasty, the founders of the medieval Mali Empire. He entered politics in 1937. He was the coordinator of art in a theater group. He helped found the Union of French West African Teachers. So in these early stages, you could see that liberation theology, the push to be independent of French colonial rule. And in his push for this, he was imprisoned for 3 weeks in 1946 at the Prison de la Santé in Paris. He was a candidate for the Constituent Assembly of the French Fourth Republic, who were supported by the Sudanese Democratic Party. But in 1946, the African Democratic Rally, the delegates pushed for a coalition, and he was instrumental in the decolonization of Mali. After we see him play as a socialist, he led his country towards progressive socialization of the economy, starting with agriculture and trade. And in 1960, creating SOMEX, in translation, Malian Import and Export Company, which uniquely had a monopoly over the exports of products of Mali. He also led the push for the creation of the Malian franc in 1962. However, as a result of severe inflation, it did not bode well for the population, led to great dissatisfaction. On the political level, he moved away from democratic principles and quickly imprisoned his opponents. In this case, moving towards the authoritarian regime and away from the ideals that he himself espoused in African socialism of democracy. In this particular case, the Pan-African, in many ways, the irony, devoted his entire life to African unity, but not to democratization. He also formed the Union of States of West Africa. He played an important role in drafting the charter of the Organization of African Unity. And so for these things, you see the contradictions in this man's political and personal life. But these were the things, the failure to establish a sound economy, the failure to open up politically and embrace the ideals of democracy were the very things that led to the military overthrow of his regime. 26 March 1991, coup d'etat. President Mossi Traoré's regime overthrown. President Mossi Traoré ruled Mali for 22 years before being ousted in a coup in 1991. How did Traoré come to power? Well, he was a Malian soldier, and he became an authoritarian leader who led his country from 1968 to 1991. As a lieutenant, he led the military ousting of former President Mobutu in 1968. And he, as I said, served as head of state till 91. He was overthrown by popular protest and himself removed by a military coup. He was twice condemned to death in the 1990s, but eventually pardoned on both occasions and freed in 2002. But what triggered the coup that brought him to power? Economic instability in the country, lack of democratic values and opportunities for the populace. We see a pattern here across. He banned all political activities in the state. It was a police, military-run state. He is in farmers, monitored academics and teachers, so no academic freedom. The socialist economies of his predecessor were partially dropped. And of course, the economy was further devastated between 1972 and 73 when a major drought hit Mali. He issued a changed constitution, which was purported to move Mali towards civilian rule, but that never became a reality. Military leaders remained in power. So again, we're seeing this pattern of behavior. He was basically reelected in 1985, but he was the only candidate, an authoritarian regime, no real opportunity for democratic voices to rise. Despite this, you can say, did the situation stabilize in the country? Yes, well, it stabilized because there was no opposition. And the people and the voices within the country focused on Mali's economic difficulties. The government approved plans for marketing, liberalization, reform in the state enterprise systems, new incentives for private enterprise. And this was agreed upon with the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. But there were many dissatisfactions with the IMF programs because there were demands for austerity in an already austere country. And as in other African countries, demands for multi-party democracy increased. And the call for independent press and independent political associations. But Traoré insisted that Mali was not ready for democracy. What ironies of ironies that we find in this situation. And so in this particular case, as I said, he had been condemned to death for political crimes, largely focused on the killing of around 300 pro-democracy demonstrators in Bamako. He was once again condemned for economic crimes, for his embezzlement of, huge sums of money. His sentences, were commuted and eventually pardoned for the sake of national reconciliation. And this goes back to saying that the good of the people was far more important. So leadership who came after him didn't want to focus the time on him. But here we have economic conditions, lack of political freedoms were key to his own demise. Colonel Amadou Toumane Touré led a military coup on March 26, 1991. He overthrew then President Moussa Traoré. He had headed President Moussa Traoré's personal guard and parachute regime. Yet again, a pattern is unfolding. Traoré, who had himself led a coup to become president and served 22 years, found himself being arrested and overthrown by the very men he had helped to bring up in the ranks of the military. Colonel Touré served for over a year as a military civilian transition head. He was instrumental in the process that produced a new constitution and multi-party elections. He then handed power over to Mali's first democratically elected president, Alpha Omar Kanari, on June 6, 1992. President Kanari promoted Touré to the rank of general. It's important to see that this individual at the same time didn't believe that the people were capable of making the decision themselves, but also at the same time, with the support of the people, brought down and removed from power the military authoritarian leader. We watch this pattern play out in Mali and in other parts of the African continent, in other parts of the world, in Latin America, in Asia. The opportunity for democracy to grow requires a strong civilian populace and the embracement of democratic ideals. It's critical to note that, in this case, Colonel Touré recognized that and believed that he had given that window of opportunity for those ideals to grow stronger. March 2012 coup d'etat. President Moussa Touré's regime overthrown. On 21 March, the 2012 Malian coup d'etat began. It began with a mutiny of Malian soldiers who were displeased with how the government had managed or failed to manage the Tuareg rebellion. They seized control of the presidential palace, state television, and military barracks. The soldiers formed what they call the National Committee for the Restoration of Democracy and State. We have a theme, a pattern in each one of the previous coups we talked about. We hear the words about democracy and economic development. But what we see is, again, a pattern of soldiers coming to make decisions for civilians. On April 6th, the junta agreed with ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, led by the West African presidents, to step down from power in return for the end of sanctions, giving power to negotiators that they could step down and create a transitional government. But by May 16th, the junta was still widely thought to have maintained overall control. And of course, atrocities were later seen by 2013 of mass grave, where the remains of 21 soldiers that were missing the year before, who were loyal to the ousted president, were found. What was the trigger for the coup? The Tuareg rebels had launched a major offensive against the Malian security forces in their bid to seize control of the northern sector and town Kidal within Mali. because we find that these well-armed fighters had returned from fighting with the Libyans in their own civil war. And they had traveled to fight for Muammar Gaddafi, so they had the expertise and skills there. But when they returned home, their dissatisfaction was launched at what many claimed to what was being done to the people in the civilian population. The coup attempt followed weeks of protests of government handling of the Nomad-led rebellion in the country's north. Soldiers demanded more weapons and resources for their campaigns against the rebel and were dissatisfied with a lack of government support for the army. President Touré was due to leave office at the end of April. What factors led to this coup, as we said? The inability of the government to control the northern section, disputes, which had been going on since the 1960s. A rise in security from AQIM, terrorist element that had flooded in from Algeria and neighboring countries. Another factor was the harsh food crisis that led to displaced populations, refugee camps, and starving women and children. We again see these were the same conditions present that triggered the other coups within the country. The rebel military forces seized control of the headquarters of the Malian state broadcasting. The soldiers blocked the path to the buildings. They entered the palace. They took over control, and we saw a mutiny unfold before our very eyes, not televised in the very same ways that we saw the January 6th failed coup in the United States. But here's what we saw: angry soldiers or retired soldiers taking over the capital. And in this particular case, they were emphasized the incompetent regime of President Touré and said it took over to hand over power to a new democratically elected government, the very same words that Touré had used when he seized power. And in this case, we see that they intended to launch an assault on the army capital. And these are the conditions. What takes place that triggers a people? The insecurities that are there. And from this perspective, we see 18 August 2020 coup d'etat, President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta regime overthrown. On the morning of 18 August 2020, soldiers began firing bullets into the air at an air base in Kati, a town about 15 kilometers, 9 miles from Bamako, the capital of Mali. The mutineers arrested the Minister of Finance, the Chief of Staff, the National Guard leader, Touré, the Speaker of the Assembly. The Prime Minister appealed for dialogue from the mutineers. The mutiny leaders, the coup leaders, claimed that President Keïta and Sese had been arrested at their former residence in Bamako. Soldiers were in pickup trucks as they stormed away from the town of Keïta. And as I mentioned earlier, they detained several government officials, including the president, who resigned and dissolved the government, the country's second coup in less than 10 years. This was not a bloodless coup. And this coup once again put the country in turmoil. What triggered the 2020 coup d'etat? Numerous factors led to the formation of the 5 June movement and the August coup d'etat. Tensions had been rising over irregularities in the 2018 Malian presidential election. The ongoing Mali war in the Tuareg-controlled northern region had intensified the situation. documentation of abuses, military abuses against civilians in the central regions of Mopti and Sogu. Dozens of attacks by armed groups in 2019 had resulted in 456 civilian deaths and hundreds of injuries. And also, we look at the COVID-19 pandemic. The first 2 cases reported were 25 March 2020, and by the end of May, there were 1,200 cases and 77 deaths. So, repeated postponements in the first round of parliamentary elections also was a trigger. At least in terms of 25 soldiers were killed in the attacks on military bases during the second round of the 2020 elections. These were the triggers that led. So the mutiny soldiers arrested President Abraham Boubacar Keïta, his prime minister Sisi, and they took over the military camp on August 18. The unrest, the pattern continues. 24 May 2021 coup d'etat. President Banda, Prime Minister Mokhtar Akan, and Minister Souleymane Doucouré were ousted. The 2021 Malian coup d'etat began on the night of 24 May, when the Malian army removed from power the interim president Bahada, his prime minister, and his minister of defense. They stripped them of their powers and said that a new election would be held in 2022. What triggered this act again? The same conditions were present on the ground. Economic instability, instability in the north, and terrorists in the country with AQIM. Tensions were high between the civilian transitional government and the military since the handover of power. Tensions came to a head when the civilian government, transitional government, called for a cabinet reshuffle, which removed 2 of their key leaders who served on the interim government. What did this mean for the people of Mali? Continued instability, a lack of conditions to move forward in this particular case. Malian interim president Bandoua, was detained by the military. He was forced to step down because he had initiated a change in his cabinet. And the military was dissatisfied because they saw themselves as losing power and control over how the country was going to go forward. So on 11 June 2021, the military government restored Colonel Sadou Camara as the Minister for Defense, and Camara had been excluded by the previous government. In this particular case, what we see is the military felt threatened as to what they would gain. And the attempt by this president to put in place the conditions necessary for democratic elections were a threat to the military control and power. The Malian lawmakers have approved a plan allowing the military government to rule for up to 5 years. The army-dominated legislature also decided that the country's interim president cannot stand for future democratic election as part of the same bill. This impoverished Sahel state has military rulers who have imposed upon the people an authoritarian regime. This has taken away from the opportunities to move forward on the democratization of the country. How has the world responded? The West African Organization, the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, imposed a trade embargo and closed its borders with Mali because of the military approach, unacceptable decision not to transition to civilian rule over 5 years. This has, in a case, stalemated, devastated the country from any opportunity to move forward in a democratic fashion. The landlocked nation of 21 million people has struggled to contain the brutal armed rebellion since 2012. And across the region, thousands of soldiers and civilians have been killed. 2 million people have been displaced by the conflict. And Mali remains the epicenter for destabilization of the region. Mali's current political situation and security is in a continuous crisis of events that launched a decade ago. The separatist fighters are still fighting under the banner of a national movement for liberation. The economic devastation in the country continues. The Tuareg continue to advance, and we still have a military regime in place. Humanitarian situation continues to become even more devastating, as some 7 million people out of the population of more than 20 million are in need of assistance because of the deteriorating conditions. We've had coups within coups, and the U.S. response has been less than satisfactory. The French have withdrawn and announced the withdrawal of their troops after 9-year deployment to fight the jihadists in the region. So what is the U.S. policy today? I think the Biden administration most certainly is challenged by COVID, Ukraine, and deteriorating humanitarian situation on the ground. So what does this mean? For the United States, is this a national security issue? Is this a humanitarian issue? How our response is framed depends on the policy of the Biden administration. I'm cautiously optimistic. I understand the constraints that the administration is enduring right now. But if we do not put resources and senior level leadership on Mali, we will see not only Mali continue to deteriorate, but the West African situation, the East African, because Sudan is in place. So, what is needed? Political leadership at the highest level focused on Mali. International focus on the humanitarian condition that's being exacerbated by drought and COVID. We also need the economic forces at play to put pressure and to put an end to a 5-year hold on democracy. The Malian people cannot wait.